Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year.
Hello everyone. Welcome to CSE's podcast Carbon Politics. I am Rudrath and I work with CSE's climate change program. Previously, we have talked about the state of multilateralism and what an equitable fossil fuel phase-out can look like. Throughout, there is one common thread: the United States of America. With the arrival of President Donald Trump as the president of the world's largest economy, the acceleration of global energy transition is poised to face significant hurdles. In this episode, we'll talk about how the dominance of US dollar, through which most of the world trades, can hinder decarbonization in the global south and how it can impact other countries. Now today, we have with us Advait, who's a climate and finance infrastructure analyst working with the Center for Public Enterprise based in the Washington, D.C. So Advait, my first question to you is, we know that the US has retreated from the Paris Agreement, but not before passing its biggest climate target. In this context, what would be the domestic and international shift in the global climate diplomacy moving forward?
That's a good question. And I think before I answer that, first, I just want to say thanks for having me on. I think this is a really important conversation, and I'm really glad to be having it with the Center for Science and Environment. I've learned a lot from the work that you guys do. It's an extremely finance-forward think tank and research program you guys have built, focused on how to deliver actual capital and financing to global South climate change mitigation and adaptation. And I think it's something the global North can learn a lot from in terms of how you guys are integrating some of the most up-to-date policy and academic work informing how you approach these problems. Anyhow, that's my praise for you all. Happy to talk a little bit more about the Conference of Parties, the COP process, and its relationship to the US's climate policy, especially the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to tell a story about the COP process that I don't know it's my story. It's how I understand how the US interacts with the UN process for talking about climate change. Other folks might have different arguments here. But the way I read it is that at least since the Paris Agreement, the COP process that the UN runs, the Conference of Parties, has become the keynote for negotiations around how much finance, how much money for mitigation and adaptation the global North countries should be giving and providing to the global South countries in some form, grants, loans, you name it. And a lot of this conversation is centered around a principle called common but differentiated responsibility. It's a principle that every country contributes unequally, but to some degree altogether, to global climate change in a way that affects all of us together. So therefore, those with the most contributions therefore have a responsibility to address climate change more so than some of the other countries that have done less. Now, the United States has never formally recognized this principle, but at least during the Biden administration, it was still engaged in negotiations at the UN about appropriate climate finance targets and, most recently, appropriate loss and damage targets for climate disasters. Now, even then, in my personal opinion, the US government has usually been a spoiler against more ambitious targets, particularly by arguing that other countries such as China should contribute more, but also because I think domestic politics in the US have not been favorable towards large capital expenditure towards global South climate needs. Now, even that, putting that aside, COP as a process has also become a venue for multilateral side deals, like the announcement of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, for example, in South Africa, but also a trade show for new technologies and new approaches to climate finance. I don't think any of these trends are really going to change. The United States, I think, is now officially, because of Trump's election, a spoiler against ambitious global climate action, both at and outside the COP process. But at least as a global venue for discussing climate progress and negotiating paths forward, I think COP is going to remain crucial for the rest of the world to coordinate. There's a lot the rest of the world can do without the US being part of this negotiation process, even if the US money is not going to, US money was never really part of it though. So I think that's what we're dealing with here, first and foremost. Now, within the United States, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. It was a series of negotiations over the first 2 years of the Biden administration that resulted in three things. One, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was a bunch of things that people on both sides of the aisle here could agree on. Second, the Build Back Better
Right.
package, which did not pass. That was the more comprehensive version of Biden's climate plan that also included a lot of social spending, a lot of preservation of pandemic era benefits for folks, and health, security, education, all bundled into climate in our thinking. But what we ended up with in 2022 was the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which cut out a lot of that agenda for political reasons internal to the US
Right.
and left us with a system of tax credits, loan programs, and a lot of grant and community development funding for various climate infrastructure development projects across the country. Now, there's a lot going
Yes.
on here, and these are pretty important tax credits, especially in how they incentivize the US to build out technology. And this would have been the US's contribution to its Paris targets through doing domestic decarbonization. It would have taken the US a
Right.
long way towards meeting those targets. Not totally, but a long way. Now, it would still increase US demand for foreign minerals, inputs, and technologies that would feed into our green industries here at home that we
Right.
want to invest in domestically. That's why South Africa wanted to use its Just Energy Transition Partnership to invest in batteries and EVs, for example, because US demand would support that effort. But now the situation is pretty different. The Trump administration is hell-bent on tearing up the IRA and on gutting the government staff needed to implement a lot of it. Tax credits, the loans, the grants, the hydrogen hubs, the carbon capture
Right.
projects, even the objectionable stuff, the folks really concerned about the climate, the Trump administration wants to tear up. You name it, it's probably on a chopping block. And there goes the
Yes.
US contribution to the Paris targets. There goes our contribution to global climate diplomacy, kind of up in smoke. And in the breach, I think we're going to see a lot more natural gas diplomacy, especially as part of tariff negotiations. And that's just going to continue what the first Trump administration did, use natural gas as a bargaining chip. The Secretary of Energy is a real big fan of that. But anyway, that's, I think, the state of US domestic and international politics right now with respect to climate.
And as you pointed out, the US has been a blocker for climate action. But our focus today is on understanding the influence of the US dollar as a major trade currency. Additionally, in your recent article, you have linked this influence to decarbonization in the global south. So, can you explain how the world is dependent on the dollar? And also, please substantiate the currency's link with decarbonization itself.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you guys want to talk about decarbonization and the dollar because I don't think that was a conversation anyone wanted to
Right.
have in the United States. What the withdrawal of the US from its own commitments to these targets is going to do for decarbonization abroad. Now, it's not direct. Of course, the IRA doesn't do anything for any country abroad directly, but the US still runs the dollar system. The US dollar is the
Right.
bedrock of the global economy. There's three ways in which I think this question I can approach it. There's trade, there's finance, there's sanctions. Happy to go through each one by one, but these are all the different ways I think the US dollar's relationship to other countries is going to be a speed bump or a roadblock to their decarbonization. So first, there's trade. Commodity trade is all invoiced in dollars. Industrial goods imports are also all invoiced in dollars.
Right.
If a firm in India wants to import oil, that's in dollars. If you want to
Okay.
import an industrial lathe, that's going to be in dollars, likely, so on and so forth. So
Yes.
the fact that most payments for foreign goods in any global South country are going to be denominated in dollars means that the value of the dollar relative to local currencies is going to change what that country's import bills. And imports, particularly of resources like natural gas, but also about capital goods, are a macroeconomic liability because they're draining central banks' dollar reserves. So that's a key reason why countries like India, China, South Africa,
Right.
Indonesia, others are far more likely actually to exploit their own domestic coal reserves, for example, than
Yes.
to import American or Qatari or Australian natural gas. Because coal, mined domestically, is not a dollar liability,
Yeah.
but natural gas is. There's a macroeconomic reason for doing what those countries are doing with their energy policy. And that's I think the first angle why the dollar matters for local decarbonization.
So, what about the finance angle?
So yes, happy to talk about the finance angle a little bit. So second, sovereign debt. I think this is something that more folks were paying attention to in the 90s and 2000s when a lot more sovereign debt was dollar denominated. But even though a lot more local sovereign debt is now local currency denominated, investors in the global north who invest in sovereign debt in the global south are still measuring their
Right.
returns in dollars. Either way, whether the debt is dollar denominated or say rupee denominated, that means the governments and central banks across the global
Yeah.
south need to have dollars on hand to pay back their external debts and backstop the value of their local currency bonds. Because foreign investors expect a certain rate of return that's not in the global south's control. Now, the US
Yes.
dollar's interest rates, which are also right now fairly high, makes raising debt in other countries that much more expensive too. The US
Right.
Federal Reserve sets a speed limit of sorts on the cost of capital that other countries face. That's just the truth. And the rise in interest rates and the rise in interest
Right.
rates in the United States made global capital costs rise everywhere else as well. Now, what that means for decarbonization is for global
Right.
South countries that want to undertake large scale adaptation and infrastructure projects without issuing debt, or they can't do that. They have to issue debt. That debt gets way more expensive when dollars get more expensive. And that actually feeds back into the trade angle. Because if the value of the dollar, if it rises and interest rates go up in the US, not only does that make
Right.
borrowing for large scale capital projects way more expensive, but it also means that importing industrial inputs, importing necessary minerals, capital goods, all of that likely becomes more expensive too relative to the
Right.
value of local currency. Currency risk, interest rate risk are all going to be a real problem for the
Okay.
dollar. And I think that's, sorry, going to be a real problem for the global South, what for project development, for long-term debt management. And that's, I think, the intersection of the trade and finance angles.
So, is there a role for American consumer in all of this?
I think so. Now, it's funny you say that. I think one thing that people are
Right.
underestimating with tariffs and with the U.S. consumer market is that the U.S., the wallet in my pocket, and in aggregate, the wallets of the pockets of everyone in this country are the
Okay.
backstop of the global economy. We spend to our spending in the United States
Right.
is the bedrock of the global economy. The dollars that we spend on global goods, the dollars that we spend on importing stuff from other countries, that's going to be really hard to replace. And there are think tanks around the global south and in Australia as well that have done some estimation about the damage that the tariff walls
Interesting.
are going to put up with respect to the global south's economies. If all of a sudden Americans stop spending on foreign imports or we just import less goods because it's more expensive for us to do so,
Right.
a lot of economic activity that happens in the global south is going to perhaps wither on
Okay.
the vine. Trade finance might collapse, shipping routes might change. There's going to be a lot of dislocation and disruption if the US puts up tariff walls. What that means is where the Inflation Reduction Act is concerned, if the United States is going to be destroying
Okay.
the Inflation Reduction Act's projects, if we're no longer building batteries or solar farms or carbon capture hubs or hydrogen hubs, a lot of the imports that we're of machinery of inputs that we're going to need from the global south are no
Right.
longer coming in. So any country like South Africa, India, anywhere else, even China, that depends on the United States for imports of goods that might be green, might be minerals, might
Right.
be just industrial inputs, that depends on the US buying those goods, they're locked out of the US market now. Those firms will suffer, those countries' trade balances will suffer because they won't be earning in dollars anymore. And all of a sudden, not only does US decarbonization get harder, but other countries that want to make decarbonization a win-win proposition for themselves and their trading partners, that goal also suffers.
There are two takeaways for me with regard to causes or structures that can hinder decarbonization, especially in the global south. One, sovereign debt being denominated in US dollars. And the second is the role of American consumers. Would you also like to talk about the role of sanctions?
I don't think I actually got the chance to talk about sanctions. I actually might as well very quickly say this. The US maintains a comprehensive sanctions and export control regime through its influence over every dollar that's transacted
Right.
through a US banking institution or related to the US. It's all onshore. There's a facility in Virginia that runs the SWIFT interbank communication system.
Yes.
We can monitor that. This is how we've sanctioned Iran. This is how the US has sanctioned Russia. This is how the US weaponizes cross-border payment systems to cut firms in target countries out of global markets,
Right.
preventing them from paying for imports in dollars, preventing them from using certain technologies, and punishing any institutions outside of those targets that do businesses with those targets. You can cut off the access to dollars. And this kind of surveillance and police power is a constraint on any
Right.
policy goal the global south might have, not just decarbonization. So, yes, there's the trade angle with imports and with import dependence on dollar denominated goods. There's the finance angle with debt. There's the sanctions angle on being policed by the US control and surveillance over the dollar. And Trump's tariff walls are going to make it a little bit harder for decarbonization and global trade to be win-wins for everybody.
Okay. So these structural power imbalance, if I can say, is what really facilitates these transactions. I want to ask now, how do we reduce a dependency on the US dollar, and what could de-dollarization could look like in the future?
Sure. So I actually think that, like, first of all, CSE and your resources have already done a lot of work mapping out the impact of the relationship global South countries have to the dollar, why that creates expensive capital, low liquidity
Right.
in the global South for all these kinds of climate projects. So your framework is a good start. I think de-dollarization looks pretty compelling in light of how vulnerable the global South is to the dollar and its fluctuations, and even fluctuations in other hard currency markets. But I don't think de-dollarization is going to be easy or simple. I'm not going to take bets about when it could happen or why it might happen. It'll take a lot of effort. But here's why I'm a little pessimistic that we're going to be immediately jumping to a de-dollarization world. First, there's a network effects problem. If most global transactions are going to be denominated in dollars, your country is not going to switch. Your firms in any global south country are not going to switch unless all of their counterparties are also going to switch away from the dollar. And that's just not like a likely proposition game theory wise. Second, currency swap markets. It is really hard to not run through the US dollar, when you're swapping between currencies. If a company in India wants to import something from a company in Thailand, it's easier and cheaper to swap rupees into dollars into Thai baht than from rupees to baht. That's just, I think, the way currency markets currently work. It's hard to get liquidity in currency markets outside of dollars or hard currencies like the euro or pound, for example. And I think there's been some discussion of a BRICS currency or the Chinese RMB becoming the global currency next if the dollar is going to lose its role. I think a lot of people talk about this, and a lot of people will keep talking about this because politically it sounds interesting. And there's even recent news that Chinese oil importers, for example, would pay for Saudi Arabian oil in RMB. Now, the accumulation of RMB in Saudi Arabia from those oil purchases could be used, of course, to pay for Chinese contracting or Chinese construction, for example, in RMB. But quantitatively, in terms of the volume of dollar trade and the volume of RMB trade, this means very little in the grand scheme of global trade networks. So replacing the dollar is going to be hard. But I think to your main question about what this means for decarbonization, just because replacing the dollar is going to be hard doesn't mean that you can't still reduce your dependence on the dollar. Now, I think the argument that I want to advance, and I think is growing more and more credible as the US takes a backseat, is that decarbonization itself is the way to reduce dollar dependence. If your country is building enough solar, enough batteries, enough transmission, and you no longer need to spend as much of your yearly annual dollar budget as a country on an uncertain, volatile amount of fuel imports, you can actually start reducing your dependency on needing to import things denominated in dollars. With the right chemical decarbonization strategies and domestic refining of green fuels, this is chemically harder, but it's also possible. You could also start producing key green feedstocks for industrial processes. Rather than import natural gas to make ammonia, you could make green ammonia with hydrogen. Now, of course, this is not actually all that easy. It's actually chemically, I think hydrogen is one of those sectors that I don't have very much faith in. But in theory, chemically, it is possible to reduce one's dependence on natural gas by using a hydrogen process, a hydrogen creation process at home to avoid spending on dollar imports of gas. Where I'm going with this is, particularly as investment in green technologies, especially in China, has sharply driven down the installation costs of solar panels, wind farms, batteries, high voltage transmission lines, hydrogen electrolyzers. It is actually pretty feasible to take upfront dollar investments in long-term infrastructure to reduce long-term dependence on the volatile prices of dollar-denominated natural gas or other, I think, feedstock imports. There are going to be risks and dependence on China geographically. It's one country, it has its risks. We saw this during the pandemic. But aside from having, these clean energy resources will reduce long-term dollar dependence, essentially. And I think that's the kind of argument that I want to advance. Upfront dollar investments in decarbonization de-risk future dollar dependence.
In your piece, you have drawn an analogy to the US's Shale Revolution and compared it with the global energy transitions of clean energy tech with other countries. Can you elaborate more on that?
So yes, I'm happy to. So I think the Shale Revolution actually might be the best example of why domestic energy investment is actually so good as a way to get off the dollar or change your global trade position. When the Shale Revolution happened in the mid 2000s, the US was very worried. There was a lot of commentary here that we're running out of the ability to produce our own oil and natural gas. We're going to be dependent on the Middle East forever for fuel imports. And all of a sudden, after a few decades of really hard technological work in the shale fields in the United States, all of a sudden we managed to commercialize. Well, not all of a sudden. There were real reasons why this happened, but we managed to commercialize shale fracking technologies for gas and then for oil. The Shale Revolution with these new technologies cut the US trade deficit in half within 4 years. I think about 4 years. It cut the US trade deficit in half. And between 2016 to 2019, I think in 2019, definitely, the US became a net energy exporter. Now, I think the fact that the US invested in shale domestically, found its way to extract natural resources, and then reduce its imports of foreign gas and oil, I think that's kind of this process of the Shale Revolution is pretty analogous to what we can expect from greater renewables and storage development, seriously dampening the need for fuel imports in the global south. Other countries have a much worse relationship to their own trade deficits and dollar position than the US does. The US
Right.
benefits from being able to import from the rest of the world. But with other countries, with their dependence on the dollar and the volatility of the dollar, it's a mixed bag. But I think the analogy is pretty cool here.
This is so interesting. And I think to a great extent, China, with regard to their exports of clean energy tech, has already reached a certain position. We have covered a lot of the pertinent questions that we wanted to address in this episode. And I just want to thank you for your time and for truly rich insights that you have brought.
Yeah, thank you for putting up this podcast. Really glad to be on here and looking forward to staying in touch about, I think, the future of the dollar as Trump decides to trash the global economy in real time.
The issue of dependency on the US dollar is riddled with complexities, but we'll keep having these discussions moving forward. Thank you so much, and please tune in every month for new episodes of Carbon Politics. Thank you.